These cliffs and hills were carved by glaciers from the bones of sea creatures. This was one of the most amazing statements that was made to me as a young man by a geologist when I've been very lucky to have grown up in the South Downs on these Seven Sisters, which are one of the most remarkable and famous, iconic kind of landscapes in the world. But it's an example to me of one of those revelations that science brings you that is just totally breathtaking, that this is not made up of rock or of stone, and it's not the accumulation of plant materials, but is in fact hundreds of meters of the sedimentation of fish and vertebrates over millions of years, compacting into a calcium deposit. And then as the glaciers receded and the violent runoffs of the mega floods arrived, the sea burst through the channel and formed these vertical lines, these cuts through these amazing undulating cliffs, this sheer expression of time beyond anything on a human scale, but the sort of history of the world, of the planet. And I love taking friends and family and colleagues along these cliffs and telling them about this and about this phenomena of it being of vertebrates, of bones. And it's still most people are completely unaware of this idea that this is actually animal matter. And it's a really key example of one of those things that happened to me as a young man, where science completely changed my life. In a really sort of positive way, but it completely undermined what my sense of reality, of what I believe to be true, of what that's the sort of the key for me. What science does is undermining or kind of challenging everything we believe to be right, or the things that we all of our preconceptions about the world are challenged, and sometimes completely reversed or revolutionized. So I'm very lucky to be able to go to these cliffs every weekend, and I sort of walk there, and it's one of those, just the expression of time in terms of a phenomenon of something beyond our experience, beyond something that we'll ever comprehend, the millions of years and this confluence of forces of I find it very breathtaking. So it's just something I wanted to start with here. So, unraveling constructed realities. I was at the Slade 25 years ago, nearly 30 years ago now, and I was walking down Gower Street, and I came across this sign, the Institute of Measurement and Control. And being a kind of young man, just freshly out of school, I was quite skeptical about institutions, and I sort of saw the kind of Orwellian sort of implications of this institute, and was like, what is that? But I started to investigate, and of course, the Institute of Measurement and Control is all about the attempts to create kind of universal measurements and lengths and weights, and it has its origins in imperial systems and of course in the French Revolution, with the attempts to create a democratic system, the meter, which is a subdivision of the circumference of the Earth. And I was sort of intrigued by this idea and the fact that in Versailles you can't actually measure the kilogram, and you can't measure the meter, because they are the Platonic, the original, and there are subplatonic meters that are used in legal cases, and then there are the rulers in our classrooms and in our offices and in our workshops, but there's a pyramid scheme which kind of break down, where you get to the top and the original meter, the original kilogram can never be touched. It's elusive, and everyone knows that it's a kilogram, but no one has ever measured it. So there is this faith that has to come in at the top of this system. And this is a very old piece now, but I thought it would be a nice one to show because of its relationship to science and certainty, and this idea of the faith within things. So this is called the Institute, the Measurement and Control for the Infinite. And it's a series of mirrors inside this kind of quite bulging kind of oak box. And within the case are a series of mirrors that face in towards each other. And so they obviously create an infinite recession within the vessel. and then they're strapped together with these leather straps. And but the only time you know there's an infinite recession in it is when it's closed. The minute you open it, the recession is gone, and it eludes you again. So the idea with this was to sort of play with that idea of certainty and the fact that those sorts of these attempts to find these truths, these essential truths or certainties are elusive, and that journey, that quest will always go on and will continue in perpetuity. Around that same time, a few years later, I was looking at trying to make these absolutes for different realities. So we made an Earth meter, and as I'm sure a lot of you know, the meter that is the French system is based on the sector of the Earth from the North Pole down to the equator through Paris. And they tried to measure this at the end during the French Revolution. So there was still a lot of kind of turbulence going on in France, and it was, I think, quite absurdist in a way, because they were trying to use all their sextants and measuring devices while being shot at by sort of royal resistance. And there was all of the calculations were done, but some of the calculations were done in error, and some of them, I think, even were forged. And so the actual sector of the Earth is slightly wrong from what it actually is. So the meter isn't actually based on anything other than a sort of idea. And the foot, in actual fact, even though it is less democratic and it refers often to the king's foot, is a more useful, more visceral element, because it refers to our body in a more humanistic way. Anyway, this is a Pluto meter. So this is about 18 centimeters long in Earth meters. And it's basically, if we were to colonize Pluto or go to Pluto, this would be the democratic measure for Pluto. And I similarly made one for Saturn and and so these are incredibly long. They're like nearly 10 meters long, the Saturn meter. I have some on the table here, which I can pass around if you want to have a Pluto meter. You can pass that around. There's the Venus is on the table here if you want to look at it later. It's a bit big to pass around. So these are really just these sort of playful things that are trying to sort of nudge at the fact that some of the constructed realities that we live in are perhaps that they aren't as real as we might think. And when we're children, we're taught these systems and these ways of indexing time, the ways of indexing space. And actually, they all have an origin, and they all are precarious. And I think with the work that I make, it's always trying to just chisel away a little bit at those assumed realities. So there were obviously 9 of these, and I would sort of arrange them in different ways. This is a new version. These pieces are about 15 years old, but actually I'm looking at making a sort of complementary set of works that are mechanical, that are about the length. They're basically about their clocks that try and measure the second on every planet. So they've taken the spin of every planet and looked at there being 3,600 seconds in a day. And so I've divided the day by 3,600, and in the end you get these extraordinary these pendulums, some of them incredibly slow. So the reason I bought Venus is almost the same size as Earth, but the year is 245 Earth years. So it spins incredibly slowly. So the pendulum of this clock will spin. It'll take 245 seconds for the pendulum to sort of tick. So it'll be this incredible, sort of slow, incremental sense of like time just almost freezing compared to our constructed reality of how we've indexed the day. And I think the history of time is really also very fascinating, and it's something I've spent a lot of time thinking about and investigating. This is a piece that I made at the Roundhouse in 2013, and I was asked to come up with a piece that would respond to the building, and I was really struggling with what to do, and I had a eureka moment where I counted the number of columns in the space, and there were 24 columns in the building. And so I suddenly thought, oh my gosh, I can turn this building into a clock. And I started investigating 24. What was the origin of 24? And it was really interesting that the 7 days of the week relates to 28 days in the lunar calendar. 365 is to do with the rotation of the Earth around the sun. All of these things had an absolute concrete reason, but the actual 24 hours of a day seemed to be quite arbitrary, and there wasn't any known reason for it. So I was sort of very interested in that, and that the actual index of the day was so kind of coincidental, and it sort of makes more sense that you would have 36 hours in a day, because it would be a fractal of 360. It would be a sort of comet 10 times less than 360. So I was sort of really interested in that the arbitrary nature of that and how different things could have been. But I was interested also in about turning the clock. This incredibly successful. This has a bit of sound if you want to put it up. This incredibly successful, ubiquitous system that the whole world uses, and it's quite tyrannical. We all are controlled and measured by this 24-hour, 12-hour system, and it's and to try and turn this mechanism, this thing that governs our lives, back into the celestial experience that it once was for all of us. When we were primeval farmers and we didn't have number, we would just use shadows to be able to the length of a shadow, the duration of a shadow, the shift of a shadow, the shadow on a solstice, the shadow on the equinox. It would be the only way of really knowing, of reckoning where we were in the year and in time. And so it was trying to turn it back into that kind of romantic, kind of spiritual thing, rather than it being just this sort of tyrannical, mathematical kind of index that is really very much about control or order or government. And so it was really, and these were some beautiful things that were done by Siobhan Davis underneath, and we had Stockhausen performances and Wayne McGregor and all these cultural events beneath this shifting kind of celestial body. So it was trying to sort of do something quite primal with this complex mechanism. So, and then this is a piece that I've made very recently, and it's a spin-off of a project I did with Royal Salute recently, and this is really inspired by the idea of, so you've got this sense of all the planets having these different durations in terms of their year, their rotation around the sun, and the different ways they spin. But one of the things that's extraordinary about another thing that I discovered recently through a physicist was that everything tends towards flatness through angular momentum. So our solar system is flat due to angular momentum, and the galaxies are flat due to angular momentum, and black hole accretions are flat due to angular momentum. So, and these spun glass disks are flat because of angular momentum. So on a micro scale, on a macro scale, there is this tends towards flatness over time. So there's this entropy towards flatness. And so I was really interested in the optics, the analogous optics of what happened to the glass when you shine light through them, that they form almost like gravitational waves. And I was very compelled by all those videos I'm sure you've all seen online of the solar system hurtling through space, and the planets revolving around the sun, and then it pans out, and you see them almost like a school of fish following a whale. And the sun is hurtling at unimaginable speeds through our galaxy, and the planets are helixing around the Earth at this. So you've got this sense of a solar system time, which is our annual time and our human time. But then beyond that, there is this unbelievable, incomprehensible idea of us traveling through the galaxy and the universe, which we don't even comprehend or cannot even register. So this spindle, this is called time spindle, is a spun aluminium machined like a spinning top, but obviously made of glass, so it's quite counterintuitive. But the vector of that is meant to connote this sense of this other sense of time. The planetary envelope is the glass, and then the spindle itself is this journey that we don't know where we're going through the galaxy. And there's another shot of it from below, so you see how the castings, and one of the other things about these is you get these anomalies within the glass, which are bubbles, which normally, if you're a glass maker or if you're a lens maker, these are called aberrations. And I actually really like this term, aberrations, because we've, as scientists, have spent thousands of years studying the rotation of the planets, yearning for the grand design of this and the sort of secrets within this, or the symmetry within this. But actually, our planets are a sort of a nice phrase for it is we're an aberration of planets. Our solar system has come about not through some grand design, but actually through a series of catastrophic events. And that sort of, I really love about the glass is that these bubbles appear in their shadows like a planet like Earth or Saturn or Venus. And so they're these aberration of planets within the planetary envelope. So psychogeometry. I've always sort of seen sort of meaning within angles and within mathematics and within shapes. And I think it's always there, and I think everyone sees something within it. It's quite elusive, the meaning within geometry, but I think that nonetheless there is meaning within it, and it is there. And I spent 25 years studying geometry, trying to perfect certain sort of geometries, particularly with the shape, the tetrahedron. And the tetrahedron to me is a shape that's very, very poignant, and it was something that I was triggered by a friend who described it to me in a different way. The Platonic solids, when I learned them at school, were described to me as there were 5 of them, and they have 4 and 6 and 8 and 12 and 20 sides. But I was never, and that sort of, I remember being taught like that, but it didn't interest me. When someone else later described them as the only ways to divide the surface of a sphere up equally, that suddenly became so much more interesting. And that's why there are only 5. And why are there only 5 ways to divide the surface of a sphere up? And that was what sort of drew me to them very, very strongly when I was a student. And I was particularly drawn to the tetrahedron because it was the simplest of the Platonic solids. And in Greek philosophy, it represents the individual unit of matter that can never be divided. And so it was the symbol of the atom, which then was a philosophical idea that was about this unobtainable idea of this entity that may well never be found. And unfortunately, our science got a little bit ahead of itself and called something the atom, which then they divided into smaller things quite quickly. So the atom really should be formally known as the atom and be called something else. But I love the other thing about the tetrahedron is that it has this incredible properties geometrically. It's very irrational. It's obviously composed of 4 equilateral triangles that fold up. So it's a 3-sided pyramid. But then when you put them together with itself, surprisingly, it doesn't form rational shapes like cubes, where it forms a bigger cube. It's completely irregular, unruly, chaotic. One of the only rules that I discovered just through trial and error was this tetrahelix. It forms this spiraling form upwards. And I have a show in the Institute of Mathematics in Oxford, which is on for another month, which this photo is taken in, where I have 40 works that all explore geometry, philosophy, and interference patterns, and it's curated by a curator called Fatos Ustek. And so I'm really proud of it as a show, and it's in a wonderful context in this sort of mathematical institute in Oxford. So there are different works within that, and I made a series of investigations into the way we can grow the tetrahedron into these helixes, and this stands outside the Francis Crick Institute in King's Cross, not far from here. And this is 14 meters high. It extends up, it weighs 30 tons, and it's a very honest sculpture in that it's bolted together, and it forms and if you were to add another one to the top, the whole thing would collapse. So it was very much, it's called Paradigm, and it's inspired by a philosophy of science in terms of the idea of the Kuhnian idea of paradigm shift or paradigm collapse, and it's outside this biomedical lab because of that message or that reminder that science has to interrogate, it has to challenge things that we believe to be real and believe to be true in order for things to progress. And it's not arrogant and it's not complacent. It's the mandate of young scientists to challenge pre-existing notions of what is proven or what is established. And only then can science really progress in a healthy way. So collapse is part of progress. These are different permutations of those paradigms. So the one furthest away is called a broad paradigm, and it grows really quickly. It grows at a sort of 25% rate. So it's quite unsustainable. It's very precarious and quite alarming. This one is called paradigm chamfer, and it has these very, very exaggerated chamfered lines. So it feels more crystalline and more kind of more almost like an amino acid or some kind of thing. But it's very rule-based, and we have a studio in Hackney, which is very much set up like a laboratory, and we really try and set very rigorous rules and logics and sort of rational ways to sort of conceive and adjust the parameters. There again is the broad, and there is a 2 meter sort of chamfer with structural within the building. This is a piece that's dedicated to the poet Yeats, which again, it's using the same geometric dogma of the tetrahedron, but it's basically the skin has been kind of taken away and formed these, and we've developed this helical stem within the center of it. And the idea of this piece is that it sort of melts away in different light levels, so it's very an optic work. So it responds to it reflects the leaves or the blue sky or the pink sky. So it melts away in different things. It's got this almost like this chameleonic skin that is very adaptive or reactive. So it plays with perception. It feels like it, against certain light levels, it disappears and cloaks itself within its environment. This is its sibling that's in the Oxford Maths show that is called it's called Fracture, and this is a rusty version that kind of grows upwards. I think one of the things I love about this one in terms of its relation to science is that there's this sense of entropy or growth. So it appears like it might be some kind of model of DNA or of an amino acid, but there's this sense of entropy and growth that somehow it's changing over time. So it's got this sort of almost counterintuitive or flawed element to it that it's a model of something, but not in stasis, but as it's growing or changing. So time is included within the model. So it could be a model of like the universe expanding, or something where time is moving upwards. But there's a sense of sort of paradox or of contradiction. So hopefully it kind of has the cloak of the rational, but beneath it there is a poetic heart. And I think that's a key sort of device that I use, is that we give the works this aesthetic of the authority of something rational, or of something of rational design, like a machine. But beneath that, there is this poetry or this irrationality or this failure often that kind of leads you into sort of more poetic interpretations. This is in the common room in Oxford at the Maths Institute. And one of the really amazing things about having it in that context is having all these augmented minds looking at the work, and these very educated, very augmented sort of thinkers, and the things that they see within the work. So I'm a great believer in the death of the author, and that I have very key reasons for making something. But actually, once it's made there and it's out there in the real world, it doesn't really matter why I made it or what I believe. It's really that these are conceptual works, and so the way that these are interpreted is so important in terms of that, and that's just as important as my raison d'être for making it. So I love talking to the mathematicians about what they see within these things, and getting the things that I would never have conceived of or thought of. Again, then that's back to the Yeats one, where you see the way that it's disappearing in different lights. And so it sort of almost feels like it's cloaking itself in the trees and the environment. This is one of the last works we've done. So the tetrahedron has been sort of in my life for 20 years, and again, it keeps on giving in terms of the properties of its geometry. It doesn't tessellate with itself, which when I first picked it up, and I thought it kind of puzzled me and upset me, because I thought, this doesn't work. And it took me a few years, and I made this ball, and I put it on my shelf in my office, and it sort of puzzled me and annoyed me. And it took me a surprisingly long time to realize, actually, that's why it's really interesting. It's within its failure that there's so much meaning and so much potential. And so this piece is called schism. And there's 100 different ways you can put 20 tetrahedrons together, but it never forms a perfect ball. And so what I love about it is that depending on who looks at it, they see something different within it. So if you're a Brexiteer, it showed that Europe was screwed up. If you're someone who believes in simulation theory, said that this proves that we live in a simulation. And there were all sorts of amazing interpretations of why what the failure meant. And so I gave the work this title, Schism, because I love this sort of crack that formed that was quite dystopic. It's quite unresting. It's quite unnerving. And these are different versions, so it just shows how there's many different ways to do it, but you can never solve the problem. And I guess in the Middle Ages, this would have sort of proven that this may have been something that the scientists or the mathematicians would not have shown the king, because this proved that there was a sort of it challenged the creationist theories that the universe was made by a divine presence. Or if he was clever, he would have just said, "Oh, he's got a sense of humor." But for me, this failure is actually why these things are so interesting. And I often make, I think, failed models because I like, as an artist, maybe as scientists, the quest is to answer questions through experimentation. But as an artist, I prefer to ask questions, create a model which creates more questions, and that for me is more exciting. So this is a version outside, and then there's a really beautiful one that I built in lockdown, and it was great fun because I had no cranes or people. I trained these two Argentinian pizza chefs, and we kind of worked in lockdown in the south of France. I got all the parts had arrived, and then lockdown happened, and I spent 6 weeks putting this together, which was a lot of fun, just using a digger. And it was a lot of work, but it was very, very rewarding. It's got this one has 19 tetrahedrons, so the one at the very base of it is removed, so you can actually walk into this, because it's made just to have this internal space where you can inhabit. And so the geometry here, you see, you come round, and this tetrahedron that's in the middle there is just very tantalizingly just off the ground. It doesn't touch the ground. It's just 3 centimeters from the ground, and you can put your hand underneath it, and it's just suspended there through the rigorous dogma of the geometry. So it's it's quite a brutal piece, but again, I love it for its the connotations it has in terms of this failure of geometry has so many a myriad of meanings. And then this one is this is called Paradigm Array. And this one is a really interesting shift in the way that I've been thinking about these works. I did this residency in Nottingham last year, and it was for 2 weeks, and I was studying the early universe with a wonderful bunch of scientists, and we were studying black holes and black hole ring down and black hole mergers and gravitational waves, and we were looking at the great expansion and all these ideas of how you can model and get back to the initial conditions. And so, having conceived these works, and I think it's a really good example how the breadth, the way you can interpret geometry, because of this experience I had last year, I no longer see these in relation to this idea of collapse, and in terms of Thomas Kuhn, this array of 9 works is called the initial conditions, the primary conditions, and I now see them in my head because I can't change it. It's just the way they've now formed in my head. Is that I see them as these expansions, or these kind of theoretical ways that the universe may have started in that rapid expansion at the beginning, in those first moments of the Big Bang. There's this broad one, or this crystalline one, and I can't get it out of my head, but I just see them as these diagrams, these space-time diagrams of the rapid expansion. So, and hence why the title, The Primary Conditions. And these works were all made in my studio in Hackney, and then we delivered them down. They're all in Sussex, in Glyndebourne, for the season down there. So so I'm really happy to have those there. Again, the chamfer. This new one is called Vex. That's in the middle. And this is a slender, so this has a 5% growth rate. There's the... And then the final psychogeometry work that I wanted to discuss in this part of the talk is called the dappled light of the sun, and this uses thousands of tetrahedrons, and they bifurcate and trifurcate, and they grow outwards, and they sort of grow into these. They really exemplar the properties of the tetrahedron, that they don't tessellate with themselves. They form these branches and almost plant-like in their nature, and they grow outwards, and they almost, and as you can see on the right-hand side, they sort of mimic a cloud. It feels like the cloud is sort of mimicking it. And there's these, and then they're very nimbly placed on these very, very slender tripods, which make them look very light, but actually they each weigh 5 tons. And so it's worth saying that I work very closely with an engineer. So in terms of a scientific relationship, I have a very enduring partnership with an engineer called Structure Workshop and Pete Laidler. And we work very closely together on trying to make the structures as extreme as possible and proving it through the numbers and through the mathematics, because I would never be able to make those tripods as thin as that just intuitively. I would never dare. But he, through the calculations, is able to prove that they will hold up, and it's been a really successful partnership that's spanned 2 decades. And the idea of this is the dappled light of the sun. It's something that it comes from an experience at the Science Museum I had when I was doing a residency way back in 2006, and I came across a phrase there that was by Dorothy Hodgkin, who's a wonderful, as you all I'm sure know, a wonderful scientist working last century, and she pioneered a process called crystal radiography, and she described that process as like trying to work out the structure of a tree by only seeing its shadow, and that was such a beautiful phrase, and it was a real inspiration to me, and it triggered me to well, these works refer directly to that, the dappled light of the sun, because we've all had that universal experience of sitting underneath a tree perhaps with a bottle of wine and staring up at the majesty of the leaves and the sunlight penetrating through that, and that idea of, could you ever imagine this tree from only the shadows on the ground? And the answer is no, and you'll never be able to see the bark or the twigs. You may get the structure after a long period of time, but you'll never understand the folds of the bark, the ants, the mitochondria, the internal structures. And so it was a very humble, very kind of modest metaphor, but obviously referring to Plato's cave. So that leads me on to mechanisms, which is a big part of my studio's endeavors are making machines, which I have to say does get quite complicated, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of resources and energy and a lot of goodwill from a lot of people who I work with who give a lot to these complex, quite mad systems that I sort of insist on building. So this one's nice and it's not too complicated. This one is in direct reference to who I just talked about, the Dorothy Hodgkin. So this piece is called Slow Arc Inside a Cube. And I had always made works that were moving, and they'd had byproducts of things that were shadows, but I'd always seen them as sort of quite theatrical. And then because I came across this phrase of Dorothy's, it gave me the impetus. I'm going to make a machine that has a product, but the only product of this machine is shadows. And it's called very simply Slow Arc Inside a Cube. And the light moves sinusoidally. The arm tucks in and out, and it moves from one corner of the cage all the way to the other, and it decelerates like a ball falling in the air, and then falls back across the cage. So there's a gracefulness to the movement. The speed profile of this is key to it feeling the way it does. If it just jerked back and forth, it really wouldn't have any of that sense of that natural sinusoidal pathway of gravity and of that centricity to the center. So I've made a series of these works, and we will end with another of these works at the very end of the lecture. But now this is another major part of my studio, which is making rope machines, which again, I've always had I saw a learning zone program when I was a student about wire rope, and I became obsessed by it. And I couldn't get it out of my head. And when I was at the Slade, I decided I've got to make a rope machine. And I was obsessed with this being some kind of model of time. And I was quite mistaken that it wasn't really a model of time. But I was completely possessed with this idea of making this machine. And this was the first one I made. And everything at the time was made of oak. And this piece is called Yarn. And it did actually work. It made this shoelace of rope. And it started me on this trajectory, and I made a real rope machine called the Nervous Systems that wove a rope very slowly out of anorak cord, and that was a great success. So it sort of spurred me on to make all these mechanical things, which was a slight curse, because it's sort of like I'm now completely addicted to making these crazy crap contraptions. So this is a machine that's in homage to Charles Babbage. So this talk is really focusing on these sort of amazing people who I've come across, who've sort of changed my life, who I've been deeply inspired by in science. So I've really edited the talk to really focus upon these greats. And so Babbage, as you all, I'm sure, know, worked very closely with Ada Lovelace, and he spent his whole life trying to build this mechanical machine that would have changed the world forever had he managed to make it. And it was a calculating device. And this machine is sort of analogous to this, but this is a rope machine that tries to unravel a rope as fast as it ravels it and feeds it back into itself. So I knew that the machine was impossible as an artist, but I decided to build it. I put my cap on as a carpenter, as an engineer. I built it all by hand myself. And knowing that it would fail, it was a flawed thing. So it was a sort of tragic machine. It's called Ode to the Difference Engine. And if you turn that handle, it just starts to crush itself. It mechanically works, but it's just this tragic kind of failure that is really about that lonely endeavor of being ahead of your time is a lonely business, basically. And I think this piece was all about this pathos I had for Babbage. And I had this sort of deep sense of sort of anguish for him as a sort of creator and as a person struggling to, because his machine, a fraction of the machine was not allowed to be shown in the Great Exhibition, and they were shunned and laughed at the time. But had he been shown in the Great Exhibition, it would have been the single most important thing aside from the steam engine within that show. So there's some really interesting sort of lessons there in terms of the way we treat our kind of pioneers and our creatives. This led me on to his wonderful, extraordinary protege and assistant, Ada Lovelace. And I made this project in 2014 that was really completely in homage to her. And it's called the Ada Project. And I read this wonderful book called Zeros and Ones by Sadie Plant. And it's very much it's a series of commissions she wrote this wonderful book, and on the first page it says, in 1833, a young girl came across a machine that changed the world and her life forever. That machine was a difference engine, and it was this wonderful image of this small child in front of a mechanical machine. So I wanted to repeat that process by putting a series of young, creative female musicians in front of another machine, which was this robotic arm, and to get her to get each of those musicians to respond to the machine. And we created a series of scores that basically were in response to the emotion, the mechanics, and the psychogeometry and the choreography of the machine. And so this is the machine. I'm not going to show you all of it because we're running a little bit short on time. But this was in the Palais de Tokyo, and so I created the movement, and then she created the music to fit over the machine. And we did 4 tracks over the series of a few years, and it was really in homage to this extraordinary woman. And I think just to encapsulate why she was so important is she's the first person to understand that number is not just quantity, it's not just apples and pears, it's entity. So it can represent data, it can represent information, and she's the first person in history to understand that. So quickly now, this is where the rope machines have got now. This is a rope machine that never repeats. All the arms are different lengths, all the spools are different thicknesses, and all the gearing is aperiodic. So once it starts, it never stops. And I've actually built this. It's in my studio. I need someone to test it. So if anyone knows of a 12 meter by 12 meter by 12 meter space, this place is even big enough for it. I really need some help with that. So if you please contact me afterwards. This is going, eventually is going to Tasmania in Australia. It's a long way away, but I do need to test it before it leaves. And again, it's very much about this irrational sense of time over, it's designed to run 24/7 forever once it's installed. You replace the spools once a year. This is it from below, just looking at the movement. So it's very pleasing, the way that they move. It's very unpredictable, the way they pass. And this is it in elevation. I think I'm going to actually go into my actual experiment now, because I think we're running a little bit low on time. This is the last chapter. So this is all about interference. So these disks are these counter-rotating disks that are filled with patterns. And you can see I've got some of these on the table. So one of the things that I brought today is this is a library that I've created over the last 20 years. And it represents the 20 years of research into interference patterns and optics. And so this is called the Library of Absence. And it's basically, there are 64 disks. There are 32 pairs of disks within this box. Its more affectionate name is the umbrette, which is a sort of Italian for shadow. And so it's a kind of version of a dance set, which is obviously all our parents had them in the 60s. You'd take a little suitcase to a party and play your 45s. And so this is the umbrette, and it's essentially this traveling case that you can experiment with. So we might start to lower the lights if possible. So you've got all these different ways of adjusting it. And then I can turn on the... Yeah. So it's all about rotational symmetry, and there are 32 pairs of disks. But actually, what I didn't realize when I made this is there's actually 16,000 combinations just from these 32 pairs, because most of them can be inverted and shown the other way around. And so you then have one I made earlier, borrow a line from Blue Peter. So I'm going to try and do a variety of things here. I'm going to basically create something that I guess is an analogy in terms of how scientists we're trying to see beyond our perception envelope, but we're trying to interpret the shadows. But will we ever be able to get to the mechanism from just the shadows? And this simple thing, there's just two pieces of paper there, and so just 4 pieces of paper is already getting quite crazy. I'm going to come on this side now. So let's go for this one. This one's pretty fun. I'm just going to put a bit of color in this one, just for a little bit of extra. Okay. was trying to get them all to be inside the frame, but we might just be outside. What's interesting is that the simpler the pattern, the more quickly the two of them become much more complex. So by repeating really complicated patterns, you don't arrive at something much more complicated, but by repeating simplicity, you arrive at something very surprising. Like, so for example, if I just put squares, you'd think that squares would not be very interesting. Where's it gone? Yeah, here we go. And I think that what's amazing about this is you could get anyone to come up and you could choose your own disks, but it creates almost an infinite number of simulations of something that you could never unravel from the shadows. So I think it's just in terms of the situation that we're in terms of the journey that we're on, as scientists, as artists, as human beings, we're at the very beginning of something. It's the beginning of, there is so much more. And the journey is going to be so long to really understand what's going on. And we may never get there. So you can change the speed. I can put the speed faster. So I can change the rotation, the speed, the brightness. That one's... And then I think if we slowly, we're doing okay. So then I guess the sort of reverse of this is to go back again. If I slowly turn one off, you then begin to sort of peel back the onion, and you begin to see the simplicity again. But it's just, this is the sort of plight of well, if I turn, this one's very dynamic. And this one has these beautiful kind of, these almost like, it feels, this is when I love this one because it feels like these two black holes, this sort of ring down, this thing I was studying last year. I think at this point we could probably lower the slow arc inside a cube. So this is the latest of the slow arc inside of the cubes, which I've been making for 15 years. And again, inspired by Dorothy Hodgkin. The original one had one cube and one light. This one has 3 layers of cage, only made of triangles, and it has 2 lights. And so it quite quickly creates this complexity and this almost like a sense of liquidity or something very natural, like you're looking at the reflections of water. And again, I think the title of this talk is Beyond the Perception Envelope. And with this work and with the work, I don't want to have there to be any smoke and mirrors. So the work, you can see the mechanism, so you can see the shadows. But the reality is, as human beings, as scientists, as artists, we're trying to see beyond our perception envelope, and we have these ingenious ways through mathematics, through induction, through experimentation, and we are getting closer, but we'll never see the mechanism. And so this work is, you as an audience member, you can see the mechanism and you can see the shadows, but it's really putting you in that sort of God's eye view. And this piece is, I guess, sort of alluding to that fact that this is an unobtainable reality. We will only ever see the shadows. Thank you.